Good evening and welcome to Red, White, and Blue. I'm your moderator, Linda Laurel. For those of you who are longtime viewers, you'll notice that we are continuing to mold our show, and you might see a few changes. We've added some elements that we feel improve the discussion and continue to keep Red, White, and Blue on the cutting edge. We begin tonight by discussing the state of our education system. In 2011, Texas cut K-12 funding by nearly $5.5 billion. That resulted in hundreds of lawsuits from local school districts claiming the funding system has become inequitable, inadequate, and unconstitutional. So what does all this mean for education in your community? Of course, we all want our children to receive a strong education, but the political battles over budgets, teacher-to-student ratios, and dropout rates are stealing the focus from what our children should be learning in the classroom. So where does that leave the future of our public education system? Here now to share their perspectives on education are three members of our advisory panel. First up this evening, the first Asian American woman to serve in the Texas House of Representatives, Dr. Martha Wong. Dr. Wong?
Hi. One of the best things that I think has happened in the state of Texas are what we call our charter schools. Some of our charter schools have given children an opportunity to learn in a new environment where it's very strict and they are performing very well. The other aspect that's come into the Texas schools are the United States program Teach for America. There we have young people who are dedicated, giving up their careers to spend 2 years teaching. These young people are very dedicated, and what we need are those dedicated teachers in our classrooms. I hope that we will also include in the next go-around choice for our children.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wong. Sharing his perspective now, Professor of American Government at Houston Community College, Dr. Sanders Anderson. Dr. Anderson?
It's oftentimes couched in the terms of choice, but the choice now in public schools is too little funding and too little choice in terms of the kinds of things that one can do. The choice has to do with the competition from charter schools, and they have a lot more leeway in terms of what they can do when it comes to public education in Texas. They oftentimes compete for the best students, and they can do certain kind of things that cannot be done in the public school system. So I think that it's very, very important for the legislature to revisit that, to provide a greater funding for these and greater support for the public school teachers. So I think that that's something that might be very useful for them to look at and maybe revisit this whole notion of choice.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Anderson. Also with us this evening, Relations Manager for Interfaith Ministries of Greater Houston, Issa Galloway. Mr. Galloway.
Thank you. I think one of the most important things that's often overlooked is to stop politicizing what the students are being taught and to look at getting back to the basics and teaching critical thinking skills. A prime example of that is we recently went through school textbook reform where we were debating elements of history and what students should learn. And another example is the standardized testing. And I can tell you, as someone who's been married to a teacher for over 7 years, the frustration level of not being able to teach students how to go and look at the information and verify it for themselves, to think critically and to actually engage in the learning process, and the movement to moving people to being able to regurgitate information for a test is really frustrating for teachers and I think unhealthy for America.
Thanks to each of you for sharing your perspectives and getting us started this evening. And now it's time for me to introduce our guests. Education Policy Analyst with the Texas Public Policy Foundation, James Golson. Also with us from the Center for Public Policy, Chandra Villanueva. And in their 12th season with Red, White, and Blue, our inimitable hosts, Gary Polland and David Jones. Gary and David?
That's pretty nice for just a couple of political guys,
well,
Gary.
I will say this. Linda certainly adds grace and beauty to our show, David.
That's true. That's true. It's too bad she's not sitting here. So what I heard from the introduction guys, and y'all are the experts, is that once again, school districts in Texas are at war with the Texas Education Agency in the courtroom because of the disaster of the last legislative session. And what we, of course, know from looking at who these kids are and where they live, these kids with underfunded education, is that now in Texas, Gary, it's now geography and demography determines your future. And if you're unlucky enough to be in South Texas, or you're unlucky enough to be one of the 900,000 new Hispanic kids that were just introduced to Texas education, your future is over.
Well, David,
it is over. Because they will not protect you. They have stopped funding you. Kids are going to school with no shoes, and where they're not even able to eat unless they go to school with the type of funding that they need.
Well, first of all, David, you're denigrating school districts in the southern part of the state that actually do a good job. I think the Laredo School District is one that does a good job. But let's move over and let's talk to our guest, Chandra, Center for Public Priorities. You've been very involved in school finance. Your head, Scott McGowan, was, I think, the original judge who struck down the school finance system years ago. And it seems like it's deja vu over again. We're back dealing with a finance system that many are challenging as unconstitutional. So if that's right, it's unconstitutional, what does your organization suggest we do?
Well, I think it's just really important to keep in mind that we have 5 million children that we're trying to educate in Texas. So we need to find a public education finance system that meets the needs so we can best serve all 5 million of these children. I'm not exactly sure what the courts are going to find, but the legislature still has time to make changes. Session is coming up. I don't think it would be responsible for the legislature to just completely kick the can down the street and wait for the courts to come back. The legislature can make some changes this session.
Well, I think what Chandra and I would agree on is that we definitely have a problem with the delivery system as far as school finance is concerned in Texas. But if we're talking about meeting the needs, the financial needs of our students, that's a question of adequacy, and we don't know, or there's no way for us to know what would make for an adequate system without first having an efficient system, without first knowing that we're getting the most for the dollars we are spending on public education. And right now we don't know that. And I think that limits our understanding of what...
But here's what we do know. We do know that politicians knew in advance that they were not funding up to the level of population growth that we have in that. They knew that, and they didn't do it. It was a deliberate, intentional act by people who are running for office and thinks that that is what voters in the Republican primary want to hear.
No, voters generally, David, because what you have proposed, I guess your plan, spend more money and raise taxes, right? Because you think Texas is undertaxed, right?
I don't think there's any dispute about that.
Okay, well, that's what you think. So you want to raise taxes, which is the fundamental question, right? Most of the voters of Texas don't want their taxes to go up, do they, James?
That is correct. We need to get there. I want to address David's point. There are definitely kids in Texas who are in education situations that are less than ideal. And those are the kids. Funding is one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is to work more choice into Texas education system. Right now, we are not a leader in that area. We don't have much on the table as far as school choice goes. We've got charter schools, but they are limited. And I think that's a direction the state needs to go.
Chandra, how about that? The only kids who have choice in Texas are children who have parents that have money. They got choice. Everyone else is stuck with a failing public school system that David describes as that.
Make my case.
In some ways that is true, but some of the proposals to expand choice really aren't going to meet the needs of 5 million children. That is a lot of children, and the Taxpayer Savers Grant that was proposed last session, TEA estimated that only 0.5% of children would be able to participate in the first year and 1% would be able to participate the second year and every year going forward. That still leaves a lot of children who would not be given choice on where they get their education from.
But don't we have a problem now that the public schools are basically monopoly in many areas, so there's really no competition? We were talking off camera about Indiana going to the school choice program, and the public schools there are actually starting to compete to get students to come to their school by advertising the things they do well. Isn't competition good?
Competition can be good, and I think one way that schools could compete more is raising salaries for teachers and making teacher benefits better. We're losing a lot of our best and brightest teachers to the private sector because the pay is just not there, and that's one way that school districts could become more competitive. But again, it's a funding issue. We would have to pay for that.
Guys, can I jump in here for just a second?
Sure.
I think anybody who has lived in Texas for any length of time knows that this whole school funding issue is nothing new. I mean, it's almost the same argument that we've been having for at least the last 20 years that I've been here. And I guess I'm curious to know, what is it going to take for us to finally solve the issue? We've got all kinds of things that have been floated around. There's all this talk about Robin Hood and the rich districts being robbed from to pay for the poor school districts. It's the same argument over and over and over again, and yet nothing ever seems to be resolved. So how do we get to the bottom of this?
That's an excellent observation. And my quick 30-second answer is, we are losing jobs, okay? there are teachers who lost their jobs. The workforce in school districts, 9% HISD, 12% Brazosport, 10% Spring Branch lost their jobs, right? So we have that. We have angry people. And the second thing is Hispanics just may start voting. And when they do, watch out.
But I think addressing some of the things we're talking about with teacher salaries and getting quality educators into the classroom, we saw Texas had a voucher program for a little while. They had a competitive choice program in Edgewood ISD's district.
In San Antonio.
Ran from 1998 to 2008. During that stretch, among numerous improvements you saw as far as academic performance, property values in the district went up. Salaries for teachers went up in the San Antonio district. They accelerated at a faster rate than those in our traditional public school system. So I think that bringing more competition into our schools can help teachers.
Do you think that the legislature is actually going to do something with this now? We've got the new TEA commissioner. We've got, of course, he's in favor of vouchers, and of course, Governor Perry is. Governor Dewhurst, Lieutenant Governor Dewhurst has come out and said that he will be supporting vouchers as well. So where do you think this is going to go in the legislature?
Well, I don't think there's going to be anything changed in terms of school finance by the legislature until they're forced to do it by the courts. Because it goes back to a fundamental problem I think we have. I don't know if anyone else agrees, but I believe we have an archaic tax system in Texas, basically set up for a 19th century agrarian economy. We have lots of things we don't tax on our sales tax because we have exemptions all over the place. Same with property tax. So we need to take a look at what kind of tax system should we have in Texas that will promote economic growth, that will also make sure that the burden is fairly fared, and that also we have enough money to do the things that the people expect government to do, which, by the way, doesn't include dressing children to go to school that David would. I mean, that's kind of the national view, David, of how much we should be spending. It's not spending money on education.
Let's leave it to the school districts who have to deal with 30% in some schools in HISD who are not in the same school at the end of the school year. In elementary school, sometimes it's up to 48% gone. So, there's a huge problem here, and to me, it's funding related.
It is definitely funding related. In the last session, the legislature changed their philosophy on funding. Instead of funding the formulas as they were set, they said, this is how much money we have. Let's figure out a mechanism to make the money we have fit the need, instead of looking at what is the actual need. That's why we had the regular program adjustment factor, which just sort of shifted how much was funded from the formulas. And that's how we got about the $4 billion in cuts. Another thing that we cut was also a lot of the grants to education, and most of those grants went to improving economically disadvantaged students. I mean, there's the high school completion grant, the pre-K grants, all of those were eliminated. 60% of the students in our public education system are low income, and the legislature decided to cut grants that directly benefited these students.
Well, maybe the legislature decided that they didn't want to fund programs they didn't think were working, because we have a dropout rate problem in Texas. We have a problem with our high schools not preparing students to do higher education. Statistics I've seen says that Houston Community College, 60% of their students that graduate from Houston area high schools need additional work before they're prepared to do college work. In a private world, that would tell you the high school's performance is a failure. Right. And you want to fund failure. You want to give them more money with a program that just frankly isn't working. Maybe we need to show the taxpayers we can actually do a good job before we keep reaching deeper and deeper into their pockets.
Well, I mean, I think that we would all agree that our ultimate goal is that every child should enter school ready. Pre-K is very important for that. I think we would all agree that every child should graduate college or career ready, depending if that's going to community college or certificate. So yeah, we do have a long way to go. But when you get down to the root of it, it's funding. When we're not willing to pay for the needs of these students, we're expected it to cost another $2 billion just for enrollment growth next year. The state needs to identify that these are needs for the 5 million children that we are trying to educate.
More money.
If you look at what we did with funding from just picking one window, 99 to 2009, we increased our education spending by about 95%. That was faster than the inflation rate in Texas, which I believe was about 20% during that stretch. We didn't see a lot of meaningful academic gains during that stretch. And when it comes to money, one of the issues we're going to run into is that eventually we are going to have to become more efficient. We don't have a limitless plot or pile of money to work with. School districts have demonstrated that when they're asked to make some adjustments, that they're capable of doing so. But going back to one of the earlier points, do we think there's going to be some change this time around, where the legislature has shied away from school choice and other things that would be viewed as reforms? I think the climate's right. I think we went through some years where that was kind of a politically toxic issue in this country. And now we're seeing other states, talking about Indiana, talking about Louisiana, starting to put in larger scale choice legislation. And I think now that maybe we could see something like that in Texas.
Mr. Golson, let me ask you, you're in San Antonio, I believe, or what
Austin.
part but you also have an agency or in San Antonio. I just want to know whether you know about Mayor Castro and his efforts to increase the tax rate, the sales tax rate in San Antonio in order to fund pre-K, and whether or not you approve of such funding mechanisms.
Well, in terms of San Antonio, that kind of falls under the umbrella of local government. I mean, if that's going to be on a referendum, they're going to be able to decide, the local voters are going to be able to decide whether that pre-K is something they want in their town. And, you know, if that's the way they decide to move with their feet, they can do that. But it's...
Is that a good idea?
To those voters, I would say that you need to know the data on pre-K, and the data on pre-K is mixed. You see one study that says, you know, you do see a lot of success at the high school level. Another says all the results cut off after third grade. So you're kind of rolling the dice.
Let me tell you something. If your pre-K is at St. John's, you're going to do fine. That's a Houston school.
Yeah, and there's just a couple things that I'd like to address. When you talk about how spending on education has increased over an amount of time, it's assuming that at one point we had adequate funding. Nobody has ever decided what is adequate funding for education. The weights and allotments that go into the formula fundings haven't even been reviewed since the late 80s, early 90s. The 10-11 interim was supposed to do a study on that. For a lot of these programs, there's mixed study results.
Absolutely.
You can say that about pre-K, you can say that about charter schools. They do have the potential to be a lab of innovation, but a lot of studies show very mixed results on charter schools, and the accountability isn't the same for public schools.
Are we we have an efficient spending of education dollars in Texas? Specifically, I'm asking, we have this myriad of independent school districts throughout this state, some that don't have a lot of students. Why is it that we have not consolidated administrative in functions of that sort in some of these smaller districts around the state?
Administrative spending is really only 2 to 3% of school staffing. There's really not a lot being spent on administrators. I think that's sort of a myth that there's way too many administrators where, I mean, you look at hospitals, you can't run a hospital with just doctors. You need all of the support staff, the teachers, aides, and the administrators.
We need a front office in small districts throughout the state that basically the taxpayers of Texas are paying for.
I mean, the reason that we do is because of the reporting requirements of TEA. You need real professionals to be able to collect and analyze all the data that's required by the state. Maybe if the state changed ways or provided more support for some of these smaller districts, but when they have to do the same things and have the same measures as all the other larger districts, you still need central staff.
Can you evaluate the qualifications of the new commissioner of Texas Education Agency, who I see as a placeholder, simply because he couldn't move up the political ladder, given that David Dewhurst lost? I mean, is that
David,
what they mean
he
by
ran for Congress?
Is that what they mean by government these days?
I think that Commissioner Williams, I think he's going to do a good job. He's got a lot of experience as far as leadership in Texas, and you know he might be a little bit new to the education community, but I think that we need somebody who's not willing to be a go-getter. Maybe introducing new ideas to the education system. I think he could be really good for that.
And I guess you don't want to take any position on this guy, right?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't met him. I don't know much about him. So at this point, I wish him luck.
Are either of your organizations suggesting how schools be financed in Texas if the courts strike down the finance system again?
I would just be happy if they recognize that the weights and allotments need to be updated. I think that would be a huge step in actually getting into what the true cost of education is. I think that would be a huge milestone.
Okay, so your organization does not take a position that we need an income tax to pay for education.
I think we need an income tax for a lot of reasons, but it would help.
And that would be one of them?
Gary thinks the income tax is the only way to bring in revenue.
Well, that's what you think.
Right. I mean, and there are a lot of other options for bringing in revenue. I mean, you guys touched on some of those before. We can broaden the tax base. We can raise taxes on cigarettes and alcohol, sugary beverages. There are options that the state has outside of a statewide property tax or an income tax.
But see, Gary, his crowd just wants to scare people.
Okay, yeah. James.
Well, our position is that there are a lot of fixes that you can bring into Texas education that don't necessarily have to directly deal with the funding. We talked about school choice. I guess this is a little bit of a funding issue, but giving school districts more flexibility to work with the money they do have rather than having state-driven mandates tell you exactly how you need to spend your money, then we can see innovation at the local level and see school districts have the capacity to meet the needs of their specific body of students rather than, the state saying you must spend X dollars Y way.
I'd be curious to know how each of you believe that the state should address the dropout problem. Obviously, it's a huge issue for us, and could cost us over $9 billion by some estimates in lost wages for those dropouts that are on the books. How do you think that should be addressed?
Well, I think first off, we need a lot more data on what's really happening and a disaggregation of the data. We really don't know how many students are dropping out. The attrition rates and the dropout rates, like a lot of it just doesn't seem very reliable, and so just more data, I think, would help be the first step in addressing that problem.
I personally think there are a couple of ways you could come at it. One would be to, we've talked about the charter schools in Texas. There are schools that are geared expressly toward at-risk students. I think if you raise the charter cap, you could maybe see more of those schools come into existence. Another way you could come at it would be an expansion of learning technologies and creating more flexibility in sort of the traditional seat time mold of public education in Texas. We don't know why all these kids drop out, but certainly some of them are dropping out for financial hardship. It's hard to go to school for an entire day if you maybe need to work. If we give them more flexibility as far as maybe you could take some of your classes online on your own schedule, have more adaptability along those lines, that might disincline some of these kids to drop out. And I think that's a good way to come at it.
I think that we would agree on some of those. We're also really much in support of dual course credits where students can get college courses while they're in high school. That's an issue for some kids. Different ways of accessing education and addressing what their different career paths would be, so to help move them into a certificate program if that's what would be helpful for them to see in school.
The state demographer, he once was anyway, Steve Murdoch, said recently to Linda's point about the lost wages is that by 2050, with the population growth of Hispanics that we have, unless we do something, we're going to be in economic meltdown in this state. We will be the new Mexico. And so there are other states that we probably could look at, especially those with funding sources that we're not using.
Yeah, who that
so
be?
that, probably 25 of them, so that we are an advancing economy rather than a regressing one, which is where we're headed now. Anybody disagree?
I mean, I would say that, the business community has come out and said that, we're going to have a problem down the line. But I think we're coming at it from a couple of different ways. One that I see significantly is accountability. We've just added the new STAR testing that is specifically geared toward getting people more college ready, more career ready. I hate to keep piling back on choice, but I think getting some bottom-up accountability into the system for these parents as well, saying, if my kid is in a school that's not doing well, not meeting the needs of my child, I have an option. I have a second choice where I can move that kid, and maybe they become more college ready and don't, they can have a good long career in Texas.
Is bilingual education, the system that we teach children who come from Spanish-speaking only homes, a bad idea given that California abandoned it years ago, went to English immersion, and apparently has been very successful?
Expressly would I say it's a bad idea. It is not, my thought would be it should not be the only idea. Right now in Texas, bilingual is mandated. That's what you have to teach your English immersion kids, or your English language learners, excuse me. Giving school districts more options, getting English immersion into the Texas system, I do think that'd be a great idea.
I mean, that might be another choice issue. It should be up to the districts and the parents.
So it sounds like both of you are really for the TEA to really start decontrolling in a lot of areas and let the districts pretty much make a lot of their decisions.
I think there could be some benefit from more flexibility within the school systems.
Absolutely.
No one other than Barbara Bush could say it better, I read recently, which is that schools in Texas, education in Texas is in crisis. We're still at 36th in the nation in graduation rates. We're 33rd in the nation in teacher salaries. And we don't seem to move. So, I mean, finish this program off by telling us exactly how it is that Texas breaks out of the pack of these miserable, failing states.
Well, I think the issue here is that Texas is not, and Chandler may disagree with me, Texas has kind of been doing the same thing for a while. We've had a system that rewards people rewards educators in the same way. We've had very limited choice. We've just kind of continued to change the funding, put more money into the system. We haven't seen a lot of results for that. And I think for Texas to really start to move forward, we need to unbind our school districts. We need to see some accountability and some power given to parents. Let things move some from the bottom up.
Get rid of high school football.
I love high school football.
But maybe get rid of the
really
$30 or $40 million stadiums. Maybe that'd be a good idea.
Well, they're funded differently than classrooms, so that's a whole different issue. But I think for Texas to move forward, we need to recognize that we do have a changing demographic, and we do have 60% of our students are low income. that does cost more to educate these students. They have more needs. A lot of the things that you were talking about where they don't come to school prepared with food in their bellies and the proper clothes and things like that. So I think that we just need to identify that there are real challenges in educating the population that we have and that it's changing.
Time is up. So, Chandra, James, very interesting views. Well, Linda, I think we raised more questions than we raised answers.
But you got to ask the questions before we can get to the answers. And we, of course, will keep the discussion going. Thanks to all of you and, of course, to Gary and David. And tonight, remember that you can catch Red, White, and Blue every Friday night at 7:30 p.m. right here on PBS, on Houston PBS, and again on Sundays at 12:30 p.m. We invite you to visit us online at houstonpbs.org, and please like us on Facebook. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next week. Good night.